I started writing this a year ago, right after Budget 2024 was announced, and lo and behold, the ever-constant march of time means the script is now topical again of Budget 2025. The original inspiration for this script was when the government announced that they will be closing the special accounts of people over 55, much to my mother's chagrin, and now it's actually happened, so another lucky coincidence in favor of me exhuming the script from the graveyard that is my hard drive. Now, it may seem a little weird for someone in their 20s to be talking about retirement, but the fun thing about time is that eventually I'm gonna be old. Hopefully. So, for those who don't happen to live in our oversized baseball field, let me tell you about Part 1, the CPF. The CPF, or Central Provident Fund, is a mandatory savings scheme in Singapore which, in effect, is primarily intended to be a pension scheme that every Singaporean has to contribute to with about a third of their income. Part of this is called the employer's contribution, but they're only contributing because they're hiring you, so it's part of your income, as far as I'm concerned. Notably, one of the big standouts of the CPF compared to other pension schemes is that you can use this money to pay your mortgage, medical bills, investments, hell, you can even pay for your children's tuition, which is where things can get more complicated. There's a lot of minutiae to talk about here, and a whole 7 paragraphs of script I'm deleting with tears in my eyes, but the specific details of how it works is not what I want to focus on here. What I do want to talk about is if the CPF works. As such, let's actually see how much people get from their CPF pensions at retirement. On their website, the CPF mentions the median monthly payouts for 2021 to 2023 and provides a spreadsheet with more detailed statistics. A 2019 study from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy estimated that you need about $1,379 a month in order to meet your basic needs in retirement. And looking at the spreadsheet, it seems like only the people in the top 30% are able to even match that, and this is without accounting for inflation. Now, I have to mention that in the study itself, they state that around half of the people aged 55 in that study would receive less than $800 a month from their final pension payouts, and that the study assumes that you have no chronic health conditions and omits, quote, things deemed extravagances like air conditioning, which for multiple reasons makes me believe that the amount is very much lowballing it. It's also important to mention that your CPF payout is tied to lifetime wages, so the lower your pension is, the more likely it is that this is your only source of income, and potentially your only source of money in general when you retire, making this all the more concerning. Now, to be fully fair, we have to contextualize why CPF payouts look so abysmal, and for that we need to look at CPF in its entirety. For what it's worth, roughly a third of the payment that goes into your CPF goes into what's called the MediSave account, which is set aside specifically for medical bills. Also, like I mentioned before, your CPF can be used to pay your mortgage, and the CPF website says roughly a quarter of CPF contributions are used this way. And, since I mentioned housing and retirement, then we also need to talk about downsizing. The idea is, once you've retired and your kids have flown out of the nest, you now have a nice big empty house you can sell off to get a smaller apartment and walk away with a nice chunk of change. The government has a scheme for it too, the Silver Housing Bonus. Essentially, you get a cash bonus from selling your flat and using the proceeds to top up your CPF account, under very specific circumstances. Of course, this idea comes with a whole chunk of assumptions about how people live their lives. First is you have a house that you can sell. If you have family that you're living with who can't or won't move out, or if you're renting your apartment or whatever, there's a lot of circumstances in which having a house you can sell off at a profit is not an option available to you. Second, even if you do have a house you can sell, how much profit are you actually getting? For those not aware, people in Singapore don't usually own their house. That most houses in Singapore are on lease, usually for 99 years, and when the lease is up, it is expected that the government will take back the property, looking back to how the government took back the properties at Geylang Lorong 3 in 2020 after their 60-year lease expired. Now, you do own the property, in that there's a lot more you can do in terms of renovations and subletting and resale compared to renting, but ultimately, when your lease is up, your lease is up. As such, the prices of properties tend to go down as they get older, though obviously the specific details can get pretty complex. And, as a side note, there are freehold estates that you can own indefinitely, though obviously those are more expensive and less numerous than public housing. Finally, does this really even matter? If we were evaluating the CPF as a pension scheme, can we really say, yeah, if you sell your house to prep for retirement, you'll have enough money is a sign of the policy succeeding? I really don't think so. Looking at the statistics, Singapore spends extremely little money on healthcare and education as a proportion of its GDP, to the point that it's among the lowest in the world. On the website for the Housing Development Board, or HDB, the body responsible for our public housing, they have a page talking about financial assistance measures, which are various ways of postponing or reducing mortgage payments temporarily while interest continues to accumulate, or telling you to rent out a room or downsize. Given all that, is it really a wonder that so many people decide to eat into their retirement funds in order to cover these things? Seeing the state of the CPF in the modern day, I can't help but ask myself, how did we get here? It seems like the CPF is being completely stretched thin by people needing to use it for housing and healthcare that they can barely use it to retire. Having the option to use their CPF money isn't inherently a bad thing, but when so many people are doing it, you have to ask why. Which then brings me to Part 2, the economic history of Singapore. Kind of. It isn't the whole history, obviously, but we do have to go back in time a bit in order to understand where we're at. In particular, I'd like to focus on the 90s and 2000s and the economic crises that shaped that time period. First, the 1985 recession. The prevalent historical narrative of that time is Singapore managed to weather the storms and pull through with grit and determination and bounce back stronger than ever. And, to the government's credit, it does seem like Singapore was able to weather the initial storms of that economic downturn, but as always, the devil is in the details. Crisis management is one thing, but how did the government deal with things after the dust settled? Let's take a look at, for instance, 1993. The government proposed a white paper titled Affordable Healthcare, talking about how it wants to structure its healthcare policies going forward. Reading through the paper, there's a lot of mention of trying to prevent overconsumption of healthcare and reduce rising healthcare expenditures, which strikes me as very strange. First of all, the idea of healthcare overconsumption is a myth. Most people aren't sitting around going, oh boy, if only healthcare were free, I'd start going to the doctor every day. And if the goal is to prevent overconsumption via people getting treatments they don't need, why not just stop doctors from prescribing these unnecessary treatments? It's already in the white paper. Why do you also have to control supply in terms of doctors and hospital beds? All of this is especially strange to me because measures like the one the white paper proposes feel a lot like austerity measures, with the aim of mitigating government spending. The thing is, austerity as a policy is intended to reduce deficits, but obviously in the 90s they had already recovered from the recession and the government's financial position was good. So why do all of this? It just doesn't make sense to me that they seem to be saying, hey, times are good, let's have less doctors. Now, what I'm saying isn't anything new. People have been discussing this for quite a while now in Singapore. For instance, I'd like to point to an article by Kenneth J. Rednam, Secretary General of the Reform Party, titled Self-Imposed Austerity. It is true that Singapore has avoided a situation where the government has had to issue foreign currency debt, and, in fact, has a substantial net asset position. But is this a good thing, and does it make our government fiscally wise? In a way, that is like saying that a starving man has avoided having a starvation diet imposed on him by voluntarily deciding to impose on it himself first. Even with cutbacks, the Eurozone countries embracing austerity programs will still have almost free public health and education, while Singaporeans do not. But what I'd like to point out is that it's not really about Singapore's asset position in the first place. Singapore was running budget surpluses in the 90s. It had a good asset position, but decided to try and control healthcare supply anyway. The starving man could have feasted, and yet he chose to purge instead of eat. Notably, the 90s also saw the popularity of the Reagan-Thatcher style of austerity policies across the world. Was Singapore just hopping onto the ideological bandwagon for the sake of it? The effects of these decisions can still be felt today. Singapore has been facing a shortage of doctors since the 2010s, and things are obviously still difficult now with COVID-19. I've made or been on videos in the past talking about my experiences with both the healthcare and education systems here in Singapore, and frankly, I would not consider my experiences positive. Changing and improving on systems like these takes time, and I find it completely bewildering that Singapore didn't take the chance to do it in the 90s when they could afford to, and instead decided on austerity, only to make having to deal with these systems miserable for everyone. It's always cheaper to spend on infrastructure earlier rather than later. So why did we try to save money by delaying spending? Is the government actually trying to save money? Or did they just not want to bite the bullet and spend then to save now? And, speaking of saving money, Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said that our recent GST hikes were in part due to rising healthcare costs, which seems to me like the Affordable Healthcare White Paper coming back to bite us. Unfortunately, this isn't the only case of Singapore enacting strange policies in the wake of a crisis. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 is also seen as a crisis that Singapore managed to weather well, so let's take a look at some of the policies enacted by the government in the wake of it. The most obvious thing that people point to is deregulation of the finance sector after the AFC, with the government emphasizing the need for a lighter touch, encouraging investments in Singapore. The question then becomes, if more investment is coming in, where is that investment going to? In order to answer that question, I need to bring up the Control of Rent Abolition Act of 2001. As you can imagine from the name, the Control of Rent Act was passed in order to keep rent prices stable after World War II, as well as restrict the situations in which landlords could evict tenants. Predictably, repealing this law would then cause rents to increase. In turn, the cost of business would go up, since if you run a business, you're going to have to pay rent. So, the expected returns on any sort of long-term business venture is going to fall, since a lot of your profits are going to be eaten up by high rents. So, what else are people going to want to invest in? Short-term, speculative investments. Or, in other words, hot money. Now, much of the impact of these changes didn't really hit in the 2000s themselves because, well, it wasn't a stellar decade for Singapore, that's for sure. So we need to push into the 2010s to get a clearer picture of what's going on. For reference, I'm looking at the Foreign Direct Investment in Singapore by Industry, parentheses, stock is at year-end, and parentheses, annual, statistics from data.gov.sg. I've formatted the data to display the investment in each sector as a percentage of total FDI. You can see that even in '98, finance and insurance were a big chunk of the FDI, but construction was similarly large, but as time went on, it got overshadowed by finance. The thing about hot money, though, is that it doesn't really provide tangible returns to society. Like when you invest in a business or in infrastructure, that results in more or better goods and services, or in, well, infrastructure that people can use. But that often isn't the case with speculative investments. In other words, speculative investments drive up demand, but they don't actually increase the productive capacity of the country. Prices go up, but everyone's wages stay the same. On top of all that, the returns on investment for Singapore are pretty bad, according to economists Manu Bhaskaran and Nigel Chiang. Singapore offers the lowest rate of return to investors not only among other emerging Asian economies, where higher returns are arguably needed to offset greater country risk, but also among the peer group of small, open economies with similar per capita GDP levels. Both groups offer similar average rates of return on FDI. Despite performing poorly on these metrics, why has Singapore still succeeded in attracting strong flows of investment commitments? Inducements offered to investors to locate their operations in regional headquarters here could have tilted the scales in our favor. If the only reason why people are investing in Singapore is because of these inducements, linked to the deregulation we talked about before, then investors are going to pull their money out the second those benefits expire, which only makes it more difficult for Singapore to get long-term productive investments. Of course, not all of our investments are actually investments either. Recently, there was a $3 billion money laundering case, which, according to the BBC, embroiled multiple banks, property agents, precious metal traders, and a top golf club. It led to extensive raids in some of the most affluent neighborhoods, where police seized billions in cash and assets. The lurid details have gripped Singaporeans. Among the seized assets were 152 properties, 62 vehicles, shelves of luxury bags and watches, hundreds of pieces of jewelry, and thousands of bottles of alcohol. The thing is, this isn't an unknown situation to the government. Singapore's buoyant property market is a popular means to clean dirty money, some experts pointed out, and there are the casinos, nightclubs, and luxury stores. We can't close the window, because if we did that, then legitimate funds will also not be able to come. And legitimate business also can't be done, or becomes very difficult to do, so we have to be sensible. K. Shanmugam, the Minister for Home Affairs, said, "When you are successful, you are a major financial center, a lot of money comes in, some flies will also come in," he added, referring to an oft-repeated quote from the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. Some analysts say this may well be the price Singapore is willing to pay to retain its position as a financial hub. If so much of the finance that we attract comes from speculators or money launderers, how is it actually going to benefit the people in any real way? It feels like things are getting worse and worse for the people living in Singapore. I recall the struggles of basically everyone I know entering the workforce and trying to find work, and how a lot of the people in my parents' generation, people who have managed to have some semblance of job security for most of their lives, were completely blindsided by how difficult things seem to be for everyone my age. But surely the government is trying to do something about that, right? Part 3. A Smarter Nation. On the 18th of February, Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong made a speech on Singapore's budget 2025. I'm not going to go beat for beat on the whole speech because it's almost 2 hours long, but I do want to pull out some key points from it because they're relevant to a lot of the things I've already mentioned and want to bring up. One of the big talking points of the speech was Singapore's rising cost of living and Singaporeans' job security, and to be fair, they are doing things to try and help. On the side of living costs, there's been some handouts given to people, but I'd like to focus in on rents in specific since I've already talked about how many problems rent is causing in Singapore. There are 4 things that tackle rent directly, on top of general cash or voucher handouts. First, up to $40,000 in corporate tax rebates with a $2,000 minimum benefit. Second, the Fresh Start program, which lets families with children in public rental flats buy housing on a shorter lease with a $75,000 grant. Third, hawker stalls get a one-time $600 payment. Fourth, there is also a 60% personal income tax rebate of up to $200. Notably, none of these things actually reduce rent at all. And considering how devastating rent has been for many, with many hawkers in particular closing down in the past couple of years, this feels very much like a band-aid solution rather than a long-term one. Meanwhile, on the job security front, I'd like to play an excerpt from the speech itself to give you an idea of the mindset behind what the government wants to do in regards to all of this.
Sir, the government is fully committed to supporting the lifelong employability of our workers. We cannot stop the waves of technological innovations, nor can we save every job. But we can and we will invest in every worker and every Singaporean. We will equip everyone with the skills to adapt, compete, and succeed in a changing economy.
To this end, the government has been pushing the Skills Future initiative since it was established in 2014. promoting skills training in order to keep the workforce employable through Skills Future credits and a new training allowance, which was expanded into a part-time training allowance this year. The thing is, I don't think this will really help much with job security, more than it helps with job flexibility. Singapore practices at-will employment, which gives employers a lot of freedom to hire and fire employees. The government solution then is to go, alright, it's fine if you get fired, we'll help you get hired again. But obviously, if you're jumping between disrupted industries and relying on training or unemployment allowances in between, it's going to tank your lifetime income and thus your CPF. And on top of all of this, we need to talk about the National University of Singapore's or NUS's general education reform. In 2020 and 2021, NUS administration announced the mergers of 6 faculties and programs, to the complete surprise of the students affected. This sparked a great deal of dissatisfaction in the student body, leading to a movement called No More Top-Down. At the time, a new established common curriculum was known to be in the works, but no official name was known until much later. Now, reforming a common curriculum seems to be rather benign, but what I want to point out is the goal of that reform. One of the core components of the new general education curriculum is artificial intelligence, which brings me to this quote from Reddit. Word on the street said they've gone full rails wage suppression because the companies are complaining that the salary is too high. The cohort numbers are not just staying elevated, but they are doubling down to make sure that the salaries don't just fall by a bit, but are crushed as much as possible. If this wasn't the case, they would have already halted or attempted to do so last year. They haven't. As someone who knows people who recently graduated from NUS, and people who are computer science graduates, I can attest to the truth of this. If all the people being pushed into the industry all have the exact same education and nothing significant to actually make them stand out from each other, how can you possibly expect wages not to nosedive? This isn't just an AI thing either. Twice as many fresh graduates couldn't find employment within 6 months this year than 2 years ago. More and more turn to contract or part-time work instead as companies replace temp jobs with AI. And so, rent is high, wages are low, and everyone is miserable. The thing is, this strategy seems to favor big business specifically. Obviously, big businesses can afford to stomach the rent, but the whole low-wage labor flexibility thing is something that primarily benefits big businesses too. I know people who have needed to handle hiring processes for smaller companies and startups, and I can tell you it's an intense process. And it takes money to have a dedicated team for dealing with people constantly moving in and out of positions. If you're a small company, what you really want is a team that sticks with you for a long time, so they can actually get invested and learn their work and have to improve things. And very frankly, it's not a good idea to screw over your long-term business partners with bad pay. And, true enough, our small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, are struggling. 58% of our SMEs only have enough cash flow to last them less than 6 months, and 85% of SMEs were unable to secure sufficient or any funding from 2017 to 2022. But SMEs contribute 48% of our GDP, and they employ 65% of our workforce. In the Budget 2025 speech itself, Lawrence Wong talks about emphasizing our enterprise ecosystem, but what's actually happening seems to contradict that. So, what's going on? Well, in 2020, audio from a closed-door meeting the year prior was leaked out of then Minister for Trade and Industry Chun Singh talking to his fellow party members. Here's the online citizen's account of the audios. Chun Singh alluded micro-companies to dying patients that the government needs to apply CPR to. But he explained that this CPR had no intention of truly reviving those who are dying, but to buy time. Mr. Chan then broke down the percentages of gross domestic product that each of these 4 segments contribute. The MNC's tier contributes more than 50% to the GDP, while the micro enterprises only contribute 4%. When it comes to the budget, which of the 4 do we give and where should I put my dollar? Definitely, I must give to the ones that create more jobs, and better pay, right? Mr. Chan challenged his audience. But the ones doing well do not seek funds from the government, he added. The ones that make the most noise are those that are going to die. The extra dollar that we collect from taxes, do we help the one that does better or the other one? Do we give them Singaporeans money? Mr. Chan asked. However, even if this was the case in the government, it was not politically prudent or correct to have an election strategy that shouted, let them die. Will you still put your hand up to support the PAP? Let's see whether we'll get 50.1% of the votes, he assured. If the government is actively letting these small companies die, letting people struggle with rent and making them jump from job to job and industry to industry, how the hell are we supposed to retire? This is our Minister for Trade and Industry. Why is he telling a quarter of our industry to die? And big businesses have to start somewhere. If all the small companies die, they'll never get the opportunity to grow. Singapore doesn't really have a lot of homegrown companies, and it's such a problem that the president of the Association of Small and Medium Enterprise effectively admitted that SMEs here can't survive in Singapore's economic ecosystem. But really, is it that surprising when it seems like the government is letting them flounder? The thing that's especially bewildering to me about all of this is that Singapore has had a lot of success raising wages in the 70s and 80s. In 1979, Singapore had a 3-year corrective wage policy, compromising, quote, strong wage increases and hikes in the CPF contribution rates, end quote, which made companies move up the value chain in order to adjust to the higher wages. And this makes a lot of sense to me. Singapore had a bunch of labor-intensive industries at the time that were taking up the bulk of jobs here, but especially given the changing situation in Singapore's small landmass and labor force, it couldn't really hope to compete with other larger economies. So, instead of competing on price or quantity, it decided to go for quality, and it worked. This is why it's so strange to me that Singapore seems to be doing a full 180 on tactics since then, because our biggest asset is our people. We have little land or natural resources, but what we do have is a small group of people we can invest in to make sure that all of us are experts in our respective fields. And we can do it faster and better than many other countries can because we're small. So why are all of our plans for the future seem to be heading in the opposite direction? And having watched all of the Budget 2025 speech, I find it rather underwhelming, especially given that this year is an election year. It's quite common to see that election year budgets have a great deal of handouts to the people, and certainly there were handouts in this year's budget, but especially compared to the last couple of years, it feels kind of lackluster. Combined with the retirement age increases and things like the closure of the CPF special accounts, I'm beginning to wonder if they simply don't have enough cash to give handouts like they used to in previous election years. And speaking of cash, it's important to remember that the CPF has another purpose on top of everything else. It's also part of Singapore's reserves and an important aspect of government financing. The thing is, if everyone's using their CPF money for housing and medical bills and education, is the remainder enough for the government's borrowing needs? Actually, how much money is in the CPF anyway? Point 4. The Hand of Providence. Content warning for threats of violence, torture, and rape. I can't talk about the CPF as a policy without talking about the political occurrences surrounding it. There have been multiple instances of public controversies surrounding the reserves, but what I wish to focus on are the behind-the-scene happenings surrounding these events. For example, in 1993, then-President Ong Teng Cheong requested that the government give him a full accounting of Singapore's reserves, which resulted in a great deal of conflict over his presidential term. At the end of his presidency, he revealed his many grievances of the government during a press conference. While Ong mentioned a long list of problems, he elaborated mainly on his attempts to test his authority as a guardian of the reserves, estimated at nearly 75 billion. Upon taking his office in 1993, he requested an accounting of Singapore's vast assets, financial as well as physical. The Accountant General initially responded that it would take 52 man-years to produce a complete list. Ong didn't back down. The list was finally submitted nearly 3 years later. Ong Teng Cheong's criticism of the government came as a surprise to all, and combined with the struggles the government had with him over his term, this made the government view him as someone they could not control. Enter Operation Acetaminophen. In order to get Ong Teng Cheong to stop speaking up about his grievances, they decided to target his wife, Ling Xiu Mei. She died exactly 2 weeks after that press conference. However, Ong Teng Cheong continued to be a headache for Singapore's government. In 2000, 6 months after he stepped down, Ong Teng Cheong held an interview of Asia Week in which he mentioned that during his final year of presidency, he had only found out about the merger of the POSB and DBS banks through the newspaper, despite the fact that the PSB reserves were, quote, to be protected by the president, unquote. Now knowing that he would not be deterred by a death in the family, the government decided to neutralize him directly. Ong Teng Cheong himself died in February of 2002. His successors have not launched a similar investigation into the reserves ever since. Unfortunately, this is not the only instance of something like this happening in Singapore's history. In 2013, Kenneth J. Ratnam started asking questions and doing his own personal investigation into the state of the CPF, using publicly available information at the time. As I've already mentioned, this is around the time rent prices were rising, and there were already whispers about how much money the CPF actually had circulating online. And, because of Operation Acetaminophen, my understanding is that the state of the reserves were allowed to fester, and thus the government was not able to simply disclose whatever non-sensitive parts of the reserves they could in order to dispel these inquiries. As a result of this probing, another operation, Operation Providence, was born. The goal of Providence was to ensure that Kenneth was neutralized, either through him ceasing his probing or through discrediting him enough that his questioning would not be believed by the public. One method used was to directly threaten Kenneth through anonymous threats under the name Hijrah Maker. The new paper had previously published an article on the multiple threats Kenneth received, but the article seems to have been taken down since. The other method Providence attempted was to try and frame Kenneth of being involved in Balraj Naidu's assistance of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or LTTE. Balraj Naidu was a member of the Reform Party, the same party that Kenneth is in, and was extradited to the US on charges of providing weapons and money to the LTTE. In order to frame Kenneth, Providence operatives needed someone else to accuse him. Now, we turn to Vikram and Harvey Shettiar. Providence operatives had noticed that she had a distant connection to the LTTE, was friends with Kenneth's son on Facebook, and was seen as more susceptible to torture due to her being a trans woman. Thus, she was chosen to be the one who would accuse Kenneth. She was falsely charged for committing a bomb hoax, and was then told that she could have her charges dropped if she falsely accused Kenneth. She refused to do so. She was then tortured in detention. Throughout this process, Harvey had not cracked and remained adamant in refusing to be a fixer for the Singapore state, causing Operation Providence to fail. Subsequently, Harvey has been charged for or investigated in relation to multiple other bomb hoaxes and an anthrax hoax in order to try and silence her. As part of the proceedings for a bomb hoax charge in 2014, she was remanded to Singapore's Institute of Mental Health for 2 weeks, where she was raped. She has also been pulled into a confluence of events that have drawn in the Christian far-right and other hostile actors, which continues to this day. Justice for Harvey on Instagram has detailed her story much better than I'll be able to in this video, and I'd encourage you to check it out if you're at all interested. I don't really have a clean way to end this video. A lot of what I talked about is still very much ongoing, and as I hope you can imagine, has very serious implications on the place that I've grown up in and hope to continue to stay in. I know that speaking out about all this comes with its risks, but I also know that keeping quiet means allowing my home and the people who live there to come under serious threat without people even knowing that they're in danger. The people who run Singapore are the very same people who are responsible for these operations. I do not believe they have our best interests at heart. This is not something any of us can run from. The only way out is through.